Good afternoon. Welcome to the webinar on getting started with reusing data. My name is Jennifer Buckley and I'm at the University of Manchester and work for the UK Data Service in User Support and Training. And I'm going to be joined today by my colleague Maureen Haker.
Hi, I'm Maureen. I'm a lecturer at University of Suffolk, largely teach on research methods in the Department of Children and Young People. And I also work with and collaborate with the UK Data Service and am a reuser of qualitative data, which is what I'll be talking about in this webinar.
So here we go, let's get started. So here's the overview of the webinar. So we're going to start with a general discussion about what data is available for reuse and some key issues about reusing data. We're then going to look at quantitative data, so we'll have a case study, look at different types of data available and some of the issues around reusing quantitative data. I'll then pass you over to Maureen to talk us through the reuse of qualitative data. Together we'll talk for about 35 minutes and then there'll be time for questions. To ask questions you'll need to type it into a questions box that's within the webinar control panel. If you can't see the box headed questions, you may need to maximise the control panel by pressing an orange arrow box, and you may need to open the question box by sort of clicking on an arrow. You can type the questions in at any point, sort of as they occur to you, and then we'll come to them all and answer them at the end. So reusing data, so through a diverse range of methods, data used for social researchers is continually being collected. Many data collections are then archived and made available for others to reuse in secondary data analysis. So data comes from data collectors, so for instance we've got research organisations such as NatSen who lead on the British Social Attitude Survey as well as other major UK surveys. There's organisations such as the Office for National Statistics, large-scale academic projects such as Understanding Society, and then also individual research teams and researchers. So here we've got a picture of Peter Townsend who conducted really important research into poverty. And data collectors are collecting data for primary research with a planned purpose. And then through the process of data sharing, that data can be used for others in secondary data analysis. So for example, on the right hand of the screen, we've got Hans Rosling, who is well known for producing very engaging visual representations of secondary data analysis. And when used in secondary data analysis, data can be used for quite a different purpose from its original purpose. So there's some really significant advantages to reusing data. So perhaps most of all, you can use data that you just could not collect yourself. So this could be, for example, data collected in the past. If, for instance, you're interested in examining working conditions over time, data from surveys such as the Labour Force Survey, which goes back to the 1970s, provides key data that just couldn't be collected. More broadly, reusing data can be time and cost effective, so major data collections require sort of resource and expertise beyond that of single researchers or small research teams. So the UK Data Service collection includes surveys with samples in the thousands that can be downloaded from the website after a short registration process. Data is high quality, and data from the main collection undergoes checks for quality and clarity. Key data collections also come from trained researchers and methodologists, from universities, government departments, statistics authorities and professional research organisations, all put into the collection of some of the data that's available. Many of the ethical issues about data collection have also primarily sort of been dealt with, thus saving time within the research process. So together these reasons may mean that secondary data analysis is perhaps the only option available for your research, or maybe just the most efficient option that's available. However, there are some important challenges and disadvantages to secondary data analysis. So first, as you are not party to the data collection, you will not have an insider's understanding of the data. As a result, you need to sort of make the effort to get to know the data, which in practice means consulting closely with any data documentation. Ethics also still apply and can affect how data can be used. So for instance, issues around confidentiality can limit data access. For instance, access to data about the geographical location of research participants is highly controlled. Also, data meeting your needs might not be available, or it might be available and just not perfect. For example, it might be older than you'd like, or the wording of the survey question might not be ideal, or an interviewer might not have probed in the way that you would have. Therefore, researchers looking to reuse data need to make an effort to understand the data and also be pragmatic about whether the data are good enough for your purpose. So to illustrate some of the issues, here's an example of a research plan with secondary data analysis. So you might start with a research question and then look to locate some data, evaluate the data, analyse the data, and then get an answer to your research question. And this looks like a linear process. But it's not usually like this. So, for example, data for the research question might not be found, which might lead you to sort of tweak and redesign the research question into something that you can look at with the available data. Further evaluating the data might lead you to further tweaks and redesigns of the research question, and then analysis might reveal some further issues. So we now have a much more complicated picture of what this research process might look like, and throughout this you'll need to be able to understand the data. So to understand data and its suitability for your research question, you must understand sort of what was collected, from who, where and when, and any changes to that raw data before being archived. And key to being able to do this is to examine sort of any documentation that comes with the data, and this might be user guides, questionnaires, and interview schedules. So just looking now at quantitative data, we'll start with the sort of case study, and then we'll look at some of the different types of quantitative data that's available, and then move on to sort of a number of specific issues about reusing quantitative data. So the Crime Survey for England and Wales is a major survey in the UK, and it provides an important source of information about levels of crime, public attitudes to crime and other related issues. And it's important for sort of policy purposes. It informs government policy, and it provides a measure of crime that's independent to reporting to the police. So the survey is now an annual survey, and it's conducted on a sort of ongoing process throughout the year, and it tends to have a sample of around 35,000 individuals aged 16 over, and then a sort of subsample of about 3,000 of those aged 10 to 15. And it asks people whether they were a victim of crime in the previous 12 months. And it also asks a range of questions covering demographics and crime-related subjects such as attitudes to the police and the criminal justice system. The data are then stored as individual anonymous records, and there's different access, levels of access to the data. So we have some data that's available under our end user license, which means once you've registered with the UK Data Service, you can download it from our website. And then we also have more sensitive and potentially disclosive information that's available under a more controlled, secure access. And the Crime Survey survey was used in a very important study of violence against people with disability by Khalife and colleagues. So they used the British, when it was called the British Crime Survey from 2009, and the introduction of some specific disability measures allowed them to do this study. The data that they needed was available at the time under a special license, so they had to go through a process of applying for the data, and then they then used a sample of just over 46,000 adults. And within this, just over 9,000 had at least one limiting disability. And they were able to reuse this data to show that once you adjust for age, sex and socioeconomic characteristics, people with a disability are at an increased risk of experiencing violence, with levels of victimisation highest amongst those with a mental health problem. And they estimated that sort of about 116,000 victims of violence were attributable to having a disability. So there are different types of quantitative data available, and these can all be used for different purposes. So to examine individuals, families, households or businesses at one point in time, you can use cross-sectional survey data or census microdata. If you want to look at trends over time, there are repeated cross-sectional surveys such as the Crime Survey for England and Wales, or the Labour Force Survey, or things like the British Social Attitude Survey. To follow individuals over time, you'll need longitudinal data, and Understanding Society is a great example of this kind of data. So Understanding Society is a household panel study that follows people within 40,000 households, asking a sort of range of questions across a broad range of topics. In terms of geography, for looking at small geographical areas, census aggregate data and flow data are a good source. And to compare countries, there are collections of international macro data, such as the World Bank indicators. So when it comes to sort of finding out where, when and how your data was collected, the place to start is with the catalogue record. So this will contain information about date and geographic coverage, and you'll also be able to find access to any further documentation, including any sort of user guides or technical reports. Understanding who was asked what is a key issue with understanding survey data. So for example, this is a small part of the questionnaire for the Labour Force survey. Documentation sort of will always look a bit different from survey to survey, but this just gives a general idea of the types of information that's available. So here we can see information about a variable called flex 10, which relates to working arrangements. You can see you get given the exact wording of the question, along with a range of answers and how they then have been coded. If you look below, it tells you that this question applied it was asked to those who were currently working, and it gives an explanation of how that was identified at the time. So in general, computer-aided interviewing makes it easy to send respondents through a questionnaire by different routes, depending on their answers. And so therefore many questions that are available, or variables that are in the dataset, will only be applicable to some of the sample. And you can also find out information about what was maybe done to raw data after it had been collected. So in this case, we can see information about a derived variable called flex 10. A derived variable based on flex 10. So flex 10 collected information about working conditions, and from this, the survey created a new variable measuring whether someone worked a 0 hours contract. With surveys and big issues that they're based on samples, so when looking at using samples, we need to think about, is the sample representative? And certain questions to think about are who's included, and what was the response rate, and was there any particular issues related to differential response rates across the population? And then also, do you need to apply a weight to make the data representative? And again, all this information will be available within the documentation that comes with the data. So we're looking at the data catalogue and then any other user guides. The second question will then be, do I have enough cases to make precise estimates? So with the, say for example, the Crime Survey for England and Wales, the sample size is very large, and that does help to allow precise estimates. However, with using smaller samples, and if you're interested in particular subpopulations, there may not be sufficient cases within a sample. For more information, especially about survey weights and complex sampling, you can see the UK Data Service guides and resources. We've got specific guides looking at survey weights and complex sampling. And here are another collection of useful resources. So there's some general guides about secondary data analysis, and then some links to specific data service resources. And at this point, I'll pass you over to Maureen.
Thank you very much, Jen. I'm, again, Maureen Haker, so I'm going to talk through very similar things as Jen, but for qualitative data. So first I'll go through a couple different types of qualitative reuse projects, then I'll walk you through a case study of one of those types of reuse, and then I'll do a quick overview on how to get started and some of the key issues you might consider. And finally, I'll show you a few ways of finding qualitative data as well. Qualitative data reuse is not particularly common, but it's certainly becoming more common. And the UK Data Service is certainly expanding its qualitative collection and offering that data in a much more accessible way than it's been able to in the past. So you can now sort of download a lot of our qualitative data sets, which wasn't always the case, particularly when we got things in that were paper-based. Okay, so different ways of reusing qualitative data. You can quite simply give a description or an understanding of a particular social and historical point in time. Why this is useful is because you can see more of the data than what publications can reveal. So you may not be able to see all the data depending on what's available in the archive, but you can certainly see more data than what was originally published. And this is useful because you won't be limited to what researchers thought was salient for their research questions and topics. You can explore it further and see what would be of interest to answering your own questions. Another way to reuse data is to consider analyzing the methods used and look at lessons that might be gleaned about the most effective ways of, for example, sampling or certain data collection methods, or even developing a topic guide or an interview schedule. One thing that's especially valuable is to look at how an interview was laid out before the interview was conducted. So that is, what sorts of questions did interviewers thought they were going to ask, and then actually look at how that interview went. There can be a lot of reasons that certain questions are or are not asked in interviews, and some interview schedules are designed to be that kind of, have that kind of flexibilities. But sometimes tangents come up and you want to interrogate that further. In any case, it's an important researcher skill to have that intuition to know what to do. And you can't really see that sort of thing unless you start comparing interview schedules with actual interview transcripts. Another type of reuse is called reanalysis, which looks at the wide range of approaches you can take in the analysis of a data set. This usually means asking a different kind of research question from what the original researchers were trying to do. So for example, Clive Seal and Charteris Black did a study using comparative keyword analysis of illness narratives. The original illness narratives had looked exclusively for health research, so they were mostly interested in symptoms and diagnosis. When Seal and Charteris Black came along to do the comparative keyword analysis, they were much more interested in an analysis of the discussions rather than the actual health issues that were coming up in the interviews. So the question can be very different in that sort of way. Or sometimes the question can be on a similar topic as the original research, but have a slightly different focus. So for example, Joanna Bornat looked at gerontology as a topic and found two different data sets that look specifically at gerontology. However, Bornat's question was related to racism, which wasn't the specific focus of the original work, but the data set was rich enough to allow her to explore this theme within that existing data. You can also have data that's reused for teaching and learning. Jo Haynes is one person who does quite a bit of this. It gives students the opportunity to work with real data and also gives them some hands-on experience working through the analysis of data and issues that arose from certain methodological choices. There's a number of teaching data sets available through our website, as well as other teaching resources which use archive data to walk students through various methodological and thematic issues. And there is a fifth type of reuse, which is exemplified by this case study I'll go through with you. And This type of reuse is called a restudy, which is where you replicate the methods of a study for the purposes of comparison. You may be looking at a historical comparison, which could help you demonstrate how society has changed over time, or it might be geographical, a class-based comparison, or a comparison with any other variable, basically, to show you any kind of difference between subgroups. This example of this kind of reuse project is from the dataset School Leavers study. The original study was conducted by Ray Paul in the 1970s as part of a much wider community study on the Isle of Sheppey. The UK Data Service holds a number of collections related to this community study, but the School Leavers study specifically looked at student aspirations. So Paul asked teachers to set a particular essay just before students were due to leave school, prompting them to imagine that they were reaching the end of their life, and something made them think back to the time that they left school. They were then assigned to write a short essay of what happened in their life over the next 30 to 40 years. In 2009, Graham Crowe and Don Lyon, and that's Graham Crowe on the left there with Ray Paul, decided to reanalyze this data set and focus solely on student aspirations. Using the very same methodology, they conducted a restudy on school leavers for students on the Isle of Sheppey in 2009 to 2010. And shown here is the prompt that was supplied to students in 2010 during the data collection. And it was nearly the same. Imagine you're at the end of your life and reflect back on what you've done since leaving school. They then transcribed those essays and compared the themes from the new set of essays with the set of essays that were collected by Ray Paul in the 70s. And you can see the wording of this prompt in a small snippet of one of the essays here. There was a challenge in doing this restudy of this specific study. When Ray Paul originally collected the data, he sort of stumbled into finding teachers who were happy to assign this essay or who had already had a similar assignment assigned. And they were able to share their essays. But he didn't have absolute control over how the essay was presented and then how it was collected from students. So if you look at the essays from the 1970s, you'll see that there is markup from the teachers because those essays were actually graded. When Graham Crowe did the restudy, the essays were not marked, and the research team had much more control over the essay prompt. Graham Crowe goes into some detail discussing this, and he did devise the prompt based on conversations with Ray Paul about the original study and how it was presented to students. Nevertheless, this is a point that Crowe addresses in his publications and comes to the conclusion that the overall picture painted by the essays as a collective still offers a valuable comparison, even if there were some slight differences in the essay prompt. So the findings definitely showed a shift in aspirations, as you might expect. And here you can see a little bit of a few more details on what was received back. So there was a slightly different gender divide, but a fairly similar overall number of essays that were received. Both data sets covered the same general themes of health, education, career, and family and leisure, but they covered them in very different ways. So how exactly were they different? You can see some examples here. So in 1978, students expected much more grounded and arguably mundane sorts of jobs. Career progression was gradual and followed on from hard work, and sometimes there was talk of periods of unemployment or even quite morbidly death. And you can see a few examples in the left column there of some of the quotations from those essays, such as the one on the bottom. I longed for something exciting and challenging, but yet again, I had to settle for second best. I began working in a large clothes factory. 2010, however, showed students imagining well-paid and instantaneous jobs filled with choice, but also with some uncertainty. Crowe and his team also noted a clear influence of celebrity culture in those essays. So, for example, again, looking at the quote at the bottom of a girl who writes, In my future, I want to become either a dance teacher, a hairdresser, or a professional show jumper horse rider. If I do become a dancer, my dream would be to dance for Beyonce or for someone really famous. The impact of this study, however, spans beyond the interesting changes they've noted in young people's aspirations. The study was part of a much bigger community project that was on the past, present, and the future of the Isle of Sheppey. The goal was to engage the community alongside this research and find innovative ways of including participants in the research outputs. As part of this initiative, they published the Living and Working on Sheppey website, which has videos and artwork that was produced by the residents of the Isle of Sheppey, as well as those who participated in the research to have ways of being able to stay in touch with each other and read about the history of their community. They help to create basically a shared history and memory of what living on the Isle of Sheppey means among this community. There's also a number of publications out there where you can read a bit more about their project and the results of their study. As I've said, this is a case study demonstrated sort of just one way of reusing qualitative data, which is a complete restudy, and comparing those two data sets. If you'd like to have a closer look at any of those slides, we will post them on the events page. I know I sort of rushed through some of the details on some of them. Okay, so we've covered different types of reuse projects you can do, but what about actually getting started doing secondary analysis with qualitative data? Well, as with quantitative data, the first thing you'll need to do is orient yourself to the original research project. I think the main point to make here, which again is very much the same as reusing quantitative data, is to not underestimate the amount of time it will take to get acquainted with the data set. There may be multiple levels of context to get through in order to really understand the data. And what I mean by this is you may have more than just the data that's collected at the time of the interview or whenever that data was collected. You may also need to consider, for example, the metadata of the participant, so whether they're male, female, a younger person or an older person, or the historical time period in which the data was collected, or even where the data was collected, you know, a northern town versus a town in the south of England. So really the idea is that you need to understand the data set as a whole in order to really get the root, to get to the root of what the data can convey. So the documentation that's provided alongside the data set will be a really useful starting point for this. It often contains more information about the methodology, such as the interview schedule or call for participants, or sometimes it can include segments from publications that arose out of the original study, or even funding applications. I've seen some studies which have sections that are written up by the principal investigator about particular features of the data set, such as the sample. So for example, Annette Lawson conducted a study in the 1980s on adultery, and given the sensitivity of the topic, particularly in that time period, sampling became a primary focus for her, and she ended up writing a 56-page document just defending her sample. In my time working with some of the qualitative data sets at the UK Data Service, I've also seen background contextual material that's taken from the area of research, such as local government meeting minutes, pamphlets, letters from participants, and again, all of that where it's held with the data set will be included in the documentation and can help paint that picture of what's going on around the study. You may also need to consider the sample. So for example, if the data set's too large, you may need to take a subsample of this. This may not be as much of an issue with qualitative research since they're usually smaller studies anyways, but there are some collections which have got a large amount of funding, and you'll need to carefully consider what's feasible. So for example, the Edwardians collection, which was put together by Paul Thompson and is widely considered the first oral history of Britain, contains 453 80-page long interviews, or some of them are more than 80 pages. this would take a considerable amount of time to read, reread, get acquainted with the data set, let alone getting into the analysis of it. So you would probably need to take a sample of that kind of data set. Conversely, you might find that there are interviews from different data sets that complement each other and together would make a new, larger data set that's more useful to you in your research question if you combined them. And again, you'll need to carefully consider how you're sampling from those different data sets and how they're combined into a single data set. Finally, you'll need to think through how you approach the data. You might choose to use an inductive strategy where you start with the data and then see what comes from that, or a deductive strategy where you have a firmer idea of what you're looking for within the data. Both are equally valid, but you will need to consider your approach before you get started. So this was a very brief overview of the couple of issues that come up when you start reusing qualitative data. If you're looking for more guidance or discussion on these issues, there's two sources I highly recommend. First and foremost is a chapter out of Silverman's most recent edition of Qualitative Research. Libby Bishop wrote this chapter specifically on reusing qualitative data, and it's filled with further examples of reuse and addresses these key issues I've already mentioned in much more detail. If you have access to that book, perhaps through your library, I definitely recommend starting with that chapter. But there's also a Timescapes Methods Guide series, which is available freely online. So it's short, it's just a few pages, but Sarah Irwin and Mandy Winterton do a good job, again, sort of highlighting some of these issues and helping you get started reusing qualitative data. There are other resources that are available through our website. So if you use the explore the Use Data tab, which is along the top here, you can see on any of our pages, the main menu. The middle one, Use Data, is what you'd be looking for. And then you can select along the left-hand menu, Secondary Analysis, and there's guides on reusing qualitative data and reusing quantitative data. There's also a bibliography of sources in both, which again can help you get started. So these reuse article tab in the middle here has a laundry list of other sources that you can look at. And finally, I wanted to go through just a couple different ways to look for qualitative data. So we have two ways that you may have seen before. And the first is by going to our key data, which there's a qualitative and mixed methods tab. So again, sort of along the top menu, use Get Data, and then you can see there's key data. And depending on what kind of data you're interested in, we have both quantitative and qualitative data sets highlighted. And of course, the other way, which you may already be familiar with, is going through our catalog, which is called Discover. And it works a bit like Google. You simply pop in a keyword into the search bar, as it's done here with food. Then you can filter down to the type of data you'd like to see using the facets on the left-hand side of the menu. So I've filtered down to qualitative and mixed methods data. However, we also have a relatively new tool which is specific to qualitative data, and that's QualiBank. Like Discover, you simply type in a keyword, but instead of searching through the abstracts and catalog pages like Discover does, QualiBank actually searches through the data itself. So this means you may be able to identify relevant interviews that are spread across different collections, or you might find a collection where you didn't think this theme might come up. So in this example, I've typed in typhoid, which you can see in the search bar here. And it's brought up several different items from the morale and home intelligence reports. So this is one particular kind of data set. Further down this search list was also interviews from the Edwardians. So it brought together different collections and highlighted within, you can see here, it highlights where the actual word appears within each data item. when you click through on one of these, so I clicked through on one of the interviews from the Edwardians, you're then brought to the actual interview or essay or whatever the item is, and you'll be brought to the part where that keyword appears. And again, just like in the search results, it'll be highlighted. If you scroll to the top of one of those interviews, as I've done here, you'll see that there are external resources and collection documentation links at the top of each page. And if you click on that, it'll take you to the bottom of the page, which includes things like, you know, perhaps there's some audio extracts of the transcript. There might be images related to that interview. Sometimes there's also web resources. It just depends on what's available. But if there's any items that are related to that specific interview, you'll be able to see them in the external resources. And finally, one last feature of QualiBank, if you wanted to cite directly from an interview transcript, you can create a citation using our Create Citation button. So you can see in the left-hand margin here, there's a Create Citation button. I would click that and then highlight which paragraphs or which lines I wanted to cite. And then this Create Citation button would turn into Retrieve Citation. I'd click that and you get a pop-up window which looks a bit like this. And you'd be able to copy and paste this citation reference into your document. And it's got a persistent identifier, which is this URL, which is at the very end of each of the citations. And if you were to click on that URL, it brings you directly to the exact paragraph that you've highlighted within QualiBank. So this is a way of being able to introduce transparency into your work, but also importantly helps you accurately cite the data that you're reusing.